Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Perfect. I can't see anything, just so you know, if I look very strange, like I have two spotlights on me, and that's all I see. It's an interesting experience. All right. My name is Roel Schouwenberg, and yeah, I'm going to be talking about the interesting bits of NotPetya. I think most of the people in the room will be familiar with some of the aspects of NotPetya, but there's a lot more to it. Let me do a brief introduction on myself. I spend most of my time on the East Coast, and I've been in InfoSec for about 20 years, give or take. And I've done all sorts of different stuff, from threat intel, malware reversing, black box, white box, whatever. Related to NotPetya, I've also been doing quite a lot of disinformation and fake news research and analysis over the last, I don't know, give or take 5 years. And that's with a focus on North America, Europe, and a little bit of Asia. It helps being multilingual, doing this kind of stuff, and seeing commonalities and differences between different campaigns. And I guess with that, what I'm trying to say is I like working on tactical stuff, so doing simple reversing, so to say, but I also like looking at strategic long-term campaigns that span months, years, or even longer than that. I will also note that I'm not a lawyer. I'm going to be using a couple terms during this talk, and some of those terms are contentious. If you want to argue with me about the definition of war, we can do it after the talk. I won't get very excited, but maybe you will. But whatever floats your boat. You may have also recently seen some of our work in the media looking at the USB fan that was being handed out at the Singapore summit. So that's a little different from regular reversing. Here's the mandatory marketing slide about the Celsius Advisory Group. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on here, but we do a lot of stuff, as you can see here. We do both offensive and defensive work, and yeah, it's a lot of fun. So here's the agenda for the talk today. As I said, I think everybody knows NotPetya, but I want to go a little bit over, what haven't we really publicly talked about? Because there's a very clear narrative that's certainly in the press and so on. And I think there's a couple things that are missing there. So that's what we'll be going over. Right. So, over the last couple of years, we've been introduced, if you will, to new types of threats, or maybe revived types of threats. Gustafer kind of comes to mind, right, where we, this is kind of something new, something different. And from where I stand, NotPetya kind of was something different altogether as well. It was a new blend of computer network operations and PsyOps. And, that's what I think it's misunderstood, and that's part of the strategy that the people behind NotPetya were really going for. And what we need to keep in mind here is that we really tend to focus on the tactical level, even when you look at fake news and disinformation as a whole. We keep talking about Twitter and Facebook bots, and it's not very forward-looking. And my personal takeaway from NotPetya was that this in history, NotPetya will be as important as, let's say, Stuxnet or whatever. I think we'll see a book or two. Not written by me. I don't like writing books, but that's where we'll go. So let's look at the premise of NotPetya that everybody should be aware of, but just as a refresher, right? It's June 27th of last year. It's been give or take a month since WannaCry. Everybody's still kind of trying to recover from that, assuming you have clients that were victim to that. And all of a sudden, you see another ransom worm, or whatever you want to call it, break out, and the mainstream media starts picking up on it, and this is one of the headlines from that particular day, and they're kind of all the same, right? Kind of have this. I'm not sure if the people in the back can read it, right? But it's very clear that there's this huge thing happening in Ukraine, but it's spreading, right? It's spreading to the West, and more and more companies are getting hit. And some of these companies are, let's say, critical infrastructure-ish, while others are very clearly more in the civilian space. So everybody, well, not everybody, but quite a few companies are getting hit, and people are getting sent home. It's that's kind of it. It's like, oh, we're infected, we can't do anything. It's time to go home because IT will be busy recovering this for the rest of the day, right? So, I mean, how big was this? Again, I think most of you people will know, but as we saw in SEC filings and so on, there were numerous multinationals who, calculated the cost at, hundreds of millions of dollars for multiple quarters, right? So that's a lot of money, right? And if you look at the companies that were hit in the West, there are quite a lot of them were in the logistics supply chain, right? And that is, I mean, that's how you move goods, right? So that's critical infrastructure, be that FedEx or be that Maersk or the port of Rotterdam. This is vital infrastructure that was down, right? The port of Rotterdam, the most automated terminal. Terminal 3 was 100% automated. That really hurt. That took weeks to regain full operational capability. And that's really, what we need to think about. We need to redefine costs, right? Because there's a huge difference between, let's say, losing, as a company, losing $1 million. If you're a large multinational, losing $1 million, let's say, it just evaporates out of the bank account, that's not really a big deal. That's uncomfortable, that's not cool, but, in the end, it doesn't really matter, it doesn't impact your business productivity, your business continuity. NotPetya, on the other hand, was designed to wreak havoc, Ransomware ultimately, impacts your business continuity process. And again, if you couple that back to the logistics supply chain companies, it really hurt. It cripples a business. And if you're a small business, that might actually mean the end of your business. So I want to take a little bit of time going over certain terms again, because when I look at Twitter, and I'm not a Twitter engineer or whatever the new term is when you spend a lot of time on Twitter, sharing your opinion. I like retweet things. That's kind of what I do, and I stick to that. So when most people talk about I/O on Twitter, they're talking about influence operations, even when they say they mean information operations. Information operations, cover the full gamut of electronic warfare, computer network operations, and psychological operations, military deception, all that kind of good stuff. That's one big thing, rather than just the influence ops or the psyops part of it, right? So this entire conversation that we're trying to have about some of these things, it doesn't help that we're not sticking to the proper terminology. And what you can kind of glean from the description of information operations, it's very important to realize that cyber is only an enabler. And I do apologize, I can't really say the word cyber in earnest. It's so overused, so sometimes I just say cyber. It gets to you. Anyhow. So that is really the important thing, right? Cyber is not it's not an end goal. It's just a means to an end, and that's that. You shouldn't make it more than that, right? And I want to talk a little bit about the PSYOPs portion of this, right? And how I don't want to make this a whole fake news disinformation talk, but the 24-hour news cycle is really driving that tactical narrative, right? Because we're being flooded with new news. So that makes it very, very hard for most people to do the strategic analysis on the one hand, and two, there's no time to read up on strategic analysis. Strategic analysis doesn't really fit into the 24-hour news cycle, which is of great help for the adversary, but doesn't help us. And for the most part, therefore, for the most part, it's all about that initial news cycle, unless the adversary is trying to push a message for a prolonged period of time by establishing a more strategic narrative. And we'll see how NotPetya was actually trying to accomplish that a little bit later. And along the same lines, I've talked to quite a few people who do like fact-checking initiatives and so on to try and show that this was misinformation or disinformation. And for the general audience, it doesn't really doesn't move the needle, and it doesn't deter the adversary. If I could actually see the audience, I would ask you guys how many people use two-factor authentication. I would probably see like a significant amount of people, but again, I can't see anything. And that is that shows that we are not the general audience. Most people don't use two-factor authentication, or certainly not for their own accounts. Maybe they're mandated so by their employer, but I think Google said like less than 1% of Gmail users use 2FA. So we are not the general audience, right? So kind of have to always keep that in mind. What's the messaging here, and who's the intended audience? So, right. Where it gets really interesting is when you start looking at cross-domain, multi-layer information operations. Because at that point, you can start using complexity as a weapon. And if you couple that back to the 24-hour news cycle, it gets even better, right? So in general, and with NotPetya in particular, you need a lot of expertise in a lot of different areas to, get a proper appreciation of what the responsible team was trying to achieve, right? And I know we as a community, we tend to dislike security through obscurity, but complexity is definitely a weapon when you need subject matter experts in both computer science, and the humanities and all that good stuff, and you kind of have to get them together into a room, and and the lawyers too. Don't forget the lawyers. And you have to get everybody into a room and kind of do that analysis. And everybody does their analysis, and you kind of have to do analysis on that, and you kind of try and figure out, what are people going for here? And that, who has time for that, right? Who does that? Plus, how do I write IOCs for this? That gets very complicated. I just want my IOCs. I want my malicious domains, my hashes, some other stuff. Put that into my SIM, and I want to be done with it. I don't want to think about any of this stuff. Like, what do I do with that? Right? But overall, right? Like why in this particular space, do you have this? This influence op element to it? Well, it's for the most part about maintaining plausible deniability. And that plausible deniability doesn't need to persist, forever. Just like, when we talk about encryption, for the most part, you kind of think, well, if I encrypt it today, it will be good for, 20 years. Well, no, that's not it. We should not expect the encryption of today to be good for, good in 20 years. That's unlikely. Some additional perspective on influence ops, psyops, whatever you want to call them, right, is from Yuri Bezmenov. I think he was actually being mentioned on Twitter again this week, and a lot of people like referencing his talk from I think 1984, and go figure. But what is important to realize here is that Bezmenov actually defected in 1970. So you can go on YouTube and you can go watch his talks and get a better appreciation for what strategic psyops really are, right? It's not, something not a campaign that lasts for 3 or 6 months or 1 or 2 years. No, ultimately this could be a multi-generational effort, right? And then you can contrast with that to the conversation that we're currently having about, how the American public is being influenced. And we talk about, Facebook bots and Twitter bots. It's very, very primitive compared to what Yuri was talking about. And again, 1970 is close to 50 years ago, right? 50 years ago is like virtually 2 generations. So we can safely assume that, these methods and tactics have really evolved through that half century. So from the technical perspective, I'm sure that everybody here is familiar with ransomware, right? You have different tier operators. Some people do the encryption well. Some people, really suck. Some people just lie and say that, your stuff is encrypted. Whatever makes money, right? And ransomware was and it still is really quite popular, and it makes a lot of sense from a cybercrime perspective, because if you want to steal somebody's, banking information and drain their bank account or steal their credit card information, you have to worry about things like fraud controls, et cetera, et cetera. But, if you either go after individuals or target a company with ransomware, there's either personal photos or, a business continuity problem that, that particular target, they want to get that fixed. So if the target decides to pay the attacker money, they intend to do that. They want to make that transaction happen. So that's really attractive for the attacker. But what ransomware also is, right, it's a great cover for action, right? As I said, ransomware, if you target a company, effectively it, stops your business productivity, right? So what if you just decide, to deploy that ransomware and, no matter how much money the target is going to give you, you're never going to give them the decryption keys for their files or for their, whatever the attacker just encrypted, server images, you name it, right? So this really is very convenient from an attacker perspective, right? Because we think of ransomware as some criminal thing, it's for criminal elements, but really anyone can use it for a computer network attack, right? A disruptive type of attack. So this cover is great because it isn't immediately obvious, who is behind this and what the motivation is for this particular attack. Unlike, let's say, Stuxnet, right? If we want to look back to Stuxnet, which, people love to, talk about Stuxnet. So in this regard, you can kind of see, all these old days, just targeting, nuclear stuff in Natanz. Well, there's only a handful of countries in the world with the necessary facilities to actually test Stuxnet and see if it works, right? So it's kind of like, your special forces team. When you see them, you know what they are, right? So it's all clandestine. The special forces team tries to remain hidden, all that good stuff. But if they get exposed, you know what they are, and it's very obvious. Ransomware is much better in that regard. Which leads me to the into the logical evolution of the question. What is attribution, and how much of the conversation we have in the public domain these days is really just conjecture. Right? Because what is real attribution? And I would add that that particular question becomes more important as the geopolitical stakes get higher, right? So if you want to look at something like, NotPetya, you don't want to, be looking at the Martha. I don't know, who watches the Americans here or who watched the Americans here, but, Poor Martha, worked for the FBI. She got recruited by the KGB, and she did work, she did work for them, right? But from an intelligence perspective, obviously Martha matters, but from a greater intelligence perspective, who is controlling Martha, right? So proper attribution can only be done through infiltration. And that, be that, real human infiltration or technical infiltration, that is clearly the domain of governments. That is not the domain of the private sector. So most of the attribution conversation that I see in the public space is mostly conjecture, certainly as the stakes get higher, right? And the nation-state actors have special capabilities, both on the offensive and defensive side, right? So you need to know about motive and intent, right? Like with the indictments that we saw recently, right? Against from the DOJ to GRU, you see like they have an idea of the command structure, they have the names, right? So at that point, the story becomes reasonably clear. This was these were approved operations, et cetera, right? This wasn't somebody doing something in their free time, using company infrastructure. No, this was an actual op. So that is the kind of detail that really is needed when you go into this particular space. And again, that is government stuff. So that leads me very quickly into the NotPetya attribution. I think CIA, GCHQ, and others have come out. This all points to GRU, APT 28 in particular. I mean, you've been reading the news, so I think that's pretty clear. You even have a White House statement in it, right, where the White House says NotPetya is the most costly attack that we've seen today, right? So that's, I think, fairly well established, and there hasn't been any evidence, to suggest anything otherwise, right? So once you have established that, the GRU was the team behind NotPetya, right? You kind of need to look at the bigger picture and get an appreciation for, how this particular actor behaves. Because again, cyber is only an enabler, right? And given that it's GRU, it's NotPetya, or quote unquote originated in Ukraine, so you kind of have to look into that particular context, right? So Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and ever since, it's been, as I say, all I/O all the time. It's one big mess. And throughout the last couple of years, or throughout those, I guess, four years, you have seen very targeted sabotage operations against, power plants, et cetera. But NotPetya clearly was something different, right? It spread to other countries. Well, it didn't really spread. It was unleashed on other countries as well, if you will. So, right, I guess the point with this particular slide is trying to make is that when we look at this particular actor's behavior also in the physical domain, right, we see that it's all about plausible deniability. I'm not sure who here remembers the little green men that started showing up in Crimea in 2014, but it was something entirely different. They didn't have the little patches on. They were unmarked, which is not okay by international norms, to say the least, right? And that initial deniability, just allowed things to move on. And I think today, the Russian government has been quite open about, how it was them all along. But, the objective here really is to make it more expensive to react to a particular act from the adversary. And that expense could be either in resources or in political capital, right? Who wants to respond to something that happened, 1 or 2 years ago, right? It's much easier to just kind of let it slide, right? And that kind of brings me to, my trigger word, which is hybrid warfare. Excuse me while I drink. So for those unfamiliar, hybrid warfare really is some relatively new term and talks about, the idea of irregular asymmetric warfare, where the adversary is using different, mechanisms to really, toe the line and, remain in that conflict boundary, to not, to not do actual acts of war, but, just skirt the line. So it's kind of like a legal game, and as I said, I'm not a lawyer, but, lawyers get really animated about this, right? So this is where there is, where there's unclarity or gaps in the law. That's just operational opportunity for the adversary. So, right? So Russia in particular loves playing in this space. Personally, from where I stand, I dislike the term hybrid warfare. Excuse me while I drink. To me, that is a concept, that I don't think that our adversaries believe in the concept of peacetime, and and therefore there is no such thing as hybrid warfare. That's my opinion. Well, on that wonderful note, I want to move on to to actually NotPetya, to kind of talk about that more on the tactical level. So NotPetya, was being pushed through this mandatory sort of quasi-mandatory tax accounting software that's used if you want to do business in Ukraine, right? And it's not like. So if you do business with any entities in Ukraine, even as a foreign company, you need to use one of two approved tax accounting software, and MEDOC was the name of the software that NotPetya was being pushed through, right? So from a CNO perspective, this was done superbly well, because the C2 channel was actually hosted on the MEDOC infrastructure itself, right? So there's nothing suspicious at all, right? If you just kind of do some casual traffic analysis and so on, then even as the implant is being pushed out to the targets, it just goes, right? So all those wonderful seams out there, they would not have picked up that kind of behavior. Plus, it's a trusted channel, right? It's trusted software, or whatever that means these days, right? So from a CNO perspective, this was really well done. This was really smooth, and would have a very, very high chance of not being picked up, at least initially, by security software, right? And as this implant was being pushed out through the trusted supply chain, right, and the malware got installed onto the victim boxes, NotPetya would start encrypting or destroying these files, and after some amount of time, the machine would reboot and give you, that particular screen. If you want to, recover your files, here's the Bitcoin address. Send us $300 worth of Bitcoin to this particular address, and then send your Bitcoin wallet ID to this particular email address. And then very, very, very quickly, somebody thought it was a smart idea to shut down this email address, which, when you're dealing with a global outbreak, maybe that's not, what you want to do, because sometimes, file recovery and paying the attacker is still better than not having your files. Yes, plus it helps tracking. That's entirely true. So why well, whatever. I mean, not the point, but that annoyed me. Again, it's important here to realize that every user of this MEDOC software was getting the software, and every person or company that wants to do business in or with Ukraine, was running either MEDOC or the other piece of software, right? So that was the target. Target demographic was users of MEDOC software, right? So as I said, it starts spreading within your local network. what was interesting about NotPetya versus WannaCry, right? WannaCry kind of indiscriminately went after WAN addresses, just spreading globally very aggressively. Again, the NotPetya actors decided that they want to keep the spreading mechanism local, right? So again, that is non-discriminate targeting of specific networks. A lot was said about how it was using Eternal Blue, the leaked exploit and all that, and that was, from my perspective, very interesting. I'll get back to that in a little bit. So it was using Eternal Blue, Mimikatz, PSExec, and WMI to do all this lateral movement and just spreading within these networks, et cetera, et cetera. And $10 billion worth of damages. That's the estimate. Okay, right? So that was that. So it was very expensive. It targeted these users of this tax software, right? So let's look at the narrative evolution for a little bit, right? So this is where it kind of gets interesting, right? So what the attackers had done very cleverly, right, is they had taken this existing piece of malware called Petya, an existing ransomware, and they had manually patched it. And I would love to go through the manual patching effort with all you guys, but I only have like 45 minutes, and ultimately that is not the point. The point was that they took a piece of malware to an existing piece of malware to confuse researchers, right, and to get that initial narrative out there. Oh, we have this new strain of ransomware. It's using Eternal Blue, and things are not looking so good. And then because the email account got taken down very shortly after, the narrative was really all about well, you can't recover your files. So fast forward a little bit, and it becomes clear, hey, this is a patched piece of malware. This is a false flag operation, right? And in cyber, false flag operations haven't been that exciting, right? But in the real world, we've seen false flag operations lead to actual, people or countries getting drawn into war. So those are sort of the stakes, right? Again, it's not a technical cyber point. So it becomes clear this is something else, and it also turns out that hey, that entire ransomware narrative, the decryption will never work, so recovery is impossible even if that account was active, and that kind of becomes the narrative, and that's kind of it, right? And kind of look at the retrospectives from last month, and that's kind of where people go, well, that was interesting, and kind of leave it at that, right? But that sounds obvious, but obviously there's a little more, and I don't think the stuff that it's where I'm coming from, that we've had any public conversation about this, which again makes properly analyzing these campaigns much more complicated. So if we look at the spreading mechanism of NotPetya, it was all about that lateral movement. You had the initial deployment to the MEDOC users, and then all those different mechanisms were about lateral movement. But as anyone who's ever done red team exercising can tell you, PSExec, WMI, Mimikatz are more than enough to spread through a network, right? And I hadn't mentioned this yet, but we actually had some clients that were affected by NotPetya. And this is what we saw here as well. Also after, post WannaCry, most people wanted to apply the Eternal Blue patches, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm strongly convinced, I'm 100% certain, that the inclusion of Eternal Blue was not needed for CNO success, right? But the inclusion of Eternal Blue, also right following WannaCry, right after WannaCry, became a major narrative around NotPetya, right? And it kind of reinforced the narrative of WannaCry, right? Here were these, these exploits, these evil exploits, and this is a problem, right? You saw the U.S. government, you saw them respond to, wow, you didn't see them, you didn't necessarily see them respond to NotPetya, you saw them respond to the fallout of, the GRU leveraging Eternal Blue, right? So that was a very distinct narrative change. So from where I stand, it would be absolutely brilliant from a PSYOP perspective, an influence op, to include Eternal Blue just to sway that narrative, right? And I think, if that were the case, if the actor did do that, I think they succeeded in this very, very well, right? And this is something that I don't think has been explored at all in the public domain, of not just doing some sort of false flag, but deliberately planting particular technical measures, if you will, to drive a particular narrative. And that I think makes things a little bit more complicated, and we need better strategic analysis, because if you're just trying to hit that 24-hour news cycle, this is going to be overlooked. Right? So, all right, so if we look at the Eternal Blue aspect, we also have to, and put that kind of in a different light. We also need to be talking a little bit more about, what was the bigger agenda here? And again, that is very, very hard because, attribution versus conjecture. But what we can do by looking at the facts, right? Like, we know that the GRU was inside the MEDOC infrastructure, ahead of time. They didn't just, get into the MEDOC infrastructure and immediately deployed NotPetya. There was a reconnaissance phase. They had an idea of who was using this. Plus, obviously, GRU are Ukraine experts, right? This should be obvious, right? So they have a very deep knowledge of their adversary. So they have an understanding of what this looks like and who uses it. So again, the target was MEDOC users. It wasn't MEDOC users in Ukraine, right? And that's an important distinction. You can make the argument here that most of the ops that were conducted in this way were really strictly focused on Ukraine. So was this sloppy work from an otherwise very, very tidy team, and a team that many consider to be on the top of their game? It's hard to tell, again, without having that inside knowledge. But that plausible deniability is something that they love to leverage. And the intended the effects of NotPetya, right? Certainly against the logistics supply chain. These are indistinguishable from what would be an legitimate objective during quote-unquote cyber war, right? If there's an actual conflict, a real conflict or actual war, an adversary would love to hit, ports and so on. They would love to hit the equivalent of a FedEx, et cetera, because it deprives the enemy from shipping, goods, be that food or be that, other types of supplies, military supplies, and so on, right? So this was either, a test run, an intended test run, or, an accidental test run to see, how the West would respond, both, on an operational level as well as a policy level, which, given the response we've seen so far from the West, I think we are potentially looking at, an opportunity for further escalation, which, wouldn't help anyone. Then, on July 4th, give or take a week after NotPetya hit, we got the usual, persona. You got to have a persona, as these ops go. And, it was a little message about, give me a bunch of Bitcoin and, I'll make the master decryption key available. And I mean, this is just about, getting another free news cycle. And at that point, they're not targeting the mainstream, the general audience. They're targeting more the tech sites out there, so to say. And it's a free news cycle for them, right? It allows them to drive out that narrative. And I think most of the news organizations who covered this particular thing, again, reiterated the issue of them leveraging Eternal Blue, right? And again, that was a major part of the narrative around NotPetya. And from my personal point of view, our devices are continually vulnerable. They're not just vulnerable between that window of when Microsoft releases the patches and you patch. That is not the window of vulnerability. The window of vulnerability is constant. So, when we look at all of this, right? So what does all of this mean, right? What does this say about doctrine, right? Because that's ultimately what this is. When we do APT research, right, and any of this stuff, this ties into an adversary's or a particular actor's doctrine, and excuse me. So when we look at these operations, right, be them Guccifer or NotPetya, et cetera, they're effectively an embodiment of this doctrine. So whatever doctrine is published, right, whatever military doctrine that we see published, that might, give something away about what a particular nation state finds acceptable in a particular domain, but, actions speak louder than words. So with that particular thing in mind, right, you can kind of see, you can start discerning what a particular actor finds acceptable behavior. And this kind of widespread, computer network attack is definitely, something different. Certainly, because again, NotPetya targeted every user of MEDOC, not just Ukrainian users of MEDOC, right? So all of a sudden, all these companies that do business with Ukraine are being drawn into this conflict, right? So all of a sudden, all these international companies are being drawn into that, right? And they're just, they're in peacetime. There's no conflict there. So all of a sudden, they are drawn into that, which raises the bigger question, right? If this is acceptable behavior, right, or maybe it was a mistake and it was all just sloppy work, but if this was acceptable, then what else is acceptable? And, furthermore, it wasn't just legitimate military targets that were being hit by NotPetya. It was also civilian targets, which is just a huge no-no, no, it's not cool. And then the other thing is, how targeted is that destructive payload? Going back to Stuxnet, right? Stuxnet infected hundreds of thousands of machines globally. But, the operators made very sure to only target very specific PLCs, right? They would only ever go after PLCs in Natanz. So even though Stuxnet was found in plants elsewhere in the world, it was quote-unquote harmless there. I just got the 5-minute warning sign, so that's good. This is my penultimate slide, and I hope to have time for like 1 or 2 questions. I think that, kind of revisiting NotPetya, one of my major takeaways was that NotPetya is a non-ICS threat, right? It's a Windows thing, right? Everybody talks about Windows. But you know, most of the ICS environments out there, for instance, at a port, you know, or a shipping company, they need input, right? These are the ICS environments are not self-contained. They need, you know, they need information with regards to orders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, guess what? You know, that information comes from Windows machines for the most part. So we saw a non-ICS threat take down all these ICS environments. Because again, if there's no data input, you know, there's nothing for the ICS environment to do, right? I mean, you should let that sink in for a bit, right? So this is a very, very interesting element as well, right? We don't need, let's say, a Stuxnet to take down an ICS environment. You can just do it this way, and you can do it with perfect plausible deniability, right? So you know, you can make the argument, right? Like the plausible deniability of, well, it was not an ICS threat, and you know, it was a worm, and therefore it spread uncontrollably. But you know, both complexity and automation introduce deniability. So this is a, you know, a great advantage for attackers. And you know, seeing this, you know, become more mainstream. I do believe that NotPetya was a template, and you know, a lot of actors, just as we saw a lot of, you know, innovation after Stuxnet, we will see more innovation on this, you know, multifaceted, multi-domain operations in the foreseeable future, and that's just going to make things more complicated for everyone. And I think, you know, the previous presenters are kind of touching that on it as well. Like we need people who understand both the you know, the policy side, the technical side, and you know, all the different domains. Because right now, you know, the cross-domain, multi-layered information operation realm is asymmetric warfare gold, and you know, the adversary is experienced and, you know, good at it, and we are not, you know, responding, which only leads to further escalation. And on that happy note, I want to mention that we have a blog post coming up in the next couple days on doctrinal cyber on celsiusio.blog. I hope in like the next 2 days. And with that, I hope I have 1 minute left for questions. Thank you. I can't see a thing if there's anyone.
There's one. Oh, sorry. Hello, thanks for the sum up of the events. I was a little bit confused by your anger about the takedown of the mail address, because from my knowledge, the research from Kaspersky showed that NotPetya was a viper and didn't show any way to recover the data. So by taking down the address, people were prevented from useless payments of bitcoins.
That's true, but at the time of takedown, that wasn't known yet. So my argument was that when we are confronted with this type of scenario, our first response should not be to take down the email address. Our first response should be to observe and analyze. Does that make sense? And
so risk people paying money and funding possibly terrorists without any chance to get their data? So I think it's a two-sided sword. You can't
Fair
tell
enough.
which is better.
It's you know, it's a different way of looking at things. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
I over a year ago argued that NotPetya was what a digital sanctions regime would look like, and if you time it with the timing of sanctions imposed on Ukraine and so forth, it would make sense. But a question I have for you is, how do you separate, if you do? I know that the federal government has attributed WannaCry to North Korea. I'm not sure that that's correct, but how do you separate NotPetya from WannaCry and from Bad Rabbit?
Well, I mean, there's no public evidence, right, to suggest that WannaCry was GRU. Bad Rabbit does seem connected to NotPetya. And I think there was a little bit more restraint when it came to Bad Rabbit rather than NotPetya. And with regards to the sanctions, I do agree. My original take on it was that, these are economic sanctions effectively, right, for anyone who is doing business in or with Ukraine. And I think I have to close it down. If you have anyone has any questions, find me outside. Thank you.